Dr. Anthony Harper here, blessed to be speaking with Karys Rhea. And Karys, thanks for joining me to talk about this so crucial topic about the rise of anti-Semitism. And I wanted to really address this. It's really in the news a lot, is about the university presidents, the anti-Semitism on the college campuses. So what is, I know that you are with Epoch Times, or some people pronounce it Epoch Times. What is the most correct one? Epoch Times, Epic Times.
Great
The
question.
jury's still out. So
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Great to talk to you and great to meet you just a few days ago at the Epoch Times Christmas party. So, as you just heard, I say epoch, but I believe the correct pronunciation is epoch. But that's a little difficult to say. So, even all of us at Epoch who know that, we still say epoch because it's just easier for people to grasp. So, you can really say it you can really either say epoch or epoch, but technically epoch is the correct way.
well, that's good to know. I mean, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of people feel more at ease right now.
That's good.
But
Glad I could contribute to that.
yeah, well, thank you. About this topic of the anti-Semitism on the college campuses. I don't hear very often about about the makeup of the people on the college campuses. If these are all students, do you have any news about if these are all students doing these riots or these protests or not? So
I'm sure, the occasional Antifa member wanders onto campus and joins them, or, the lone Islamist here or there. But I would have no reason to believe that it's not largely students, because for those of us who've been following anti Semitism on college campuses for over a decade now, I've been looking at this since I was in college. And, it's been just gradually getting worse since then. But it's been an issue as long as I've been looking at it. And it's a combination of uh, left wing progressive students that are getting increasingly hostile and revolutionary, right? And as well as the Muslim student populations, some of whom are foreign nationals, but others are, born in the United States, and whether they are conservative or liberal, they are certainly anti-Israel, and that seems to be a value that really unites Muslims across the board, with very few exceptions. And this tends to make up a very substantial proportion of the student body, even if it's not substantial in terms of the numbers. It's substantial in terms of their influence and their power and how loud they scream. Plus, they have the support of many of the faculty members and the administrators who share the same ideology, and that's basically what you're seeing. With these three college presidents and their failure to, be take a morally unambiguous position on these matters.
has that been addressed in Ep- Epoch Times, specifically about this issue, but also about other university presidents that are in violation as well?
Yeah, I'm sure. I, I don't. I'm sure Epoch has been covering it across the board on different shows and in our newspaper. But I can tell you for sure that we've been covering it on my show. We've had a number of people on, and just today we interviewed Ilya Shapiro about it, and he had wonderful insight about the limits of the First Amendment. And I think it will be really valuable for our viewers to understand, because many of our viewers are what you would call free speech absolutists, right? So they might say, unless there's a very, very clear incitement to violence or some very rare exception, anything goes. But I think that they might not realize that, first of all, these universities that we're looking at are private universities, and you know, whether they are a First Amendment college or not is really up to them. So they don't necessarily have to follow free speech laws, but they do have to follow their own policies and code of ethics and codes of conduct. They also are beholden to Title VI laws and civil rights laws, which basically apply across the board. Title VI is one part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that addresses discrimination against certain groups and identities. So he really laid out where the limits of free speech lie on college campuses, and what was really so problematic about this hearing. And what he said, which was so fascinating to me, was what bothered him the most was not that their answers to the question of whether it was okay to call for the genocide of the Jews, depending on the context. What bothered him was that they addressed the answer in a legalistic fashion, as if they were participating in some sort of trial. But this wasn't a trial, right? They weren't in a legal courtroom. This was a hearing, right, about moral clarity, right? This was to clarify what their position is from a moral perspective, right? They weren't there to be answering to be getting into the legalistic jargon, because they weren't questioned in that way, right? That's not what Representative Stefanik was asking them to do. She was just asking them to provide some moral clarity on the matter, and they could not do that. They had an opportunity to show the world what their university's mission was all about, and how they're teaching their students and what their values are, and they utterly failed in that regard.
Okay, the two words, context-based. It wasn't the response of university presidents something that's about a matter of context?
Right, exactly.
They really couldn't get to the answer. They couldn't answer the question. So.
Right. So there was a few different answers and a whole bunch of questions, but the crux of it was that when the Congress members asked them, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate your campus's code of conduct? And they virtually all said it depends on the context. It can, if it rises to the level of conduct or harassment, or if it's directed at an individual. Once again, they are approaching this as if it's a legalistic matter, and that's not what it was about. So yeah, I mean, it was, and the reason why it's so upsetting, regardless of whether that's true or not, because again, from a legal perspective, that can be true. Calling for genocide does not always violate the first. It's not always a violation of the First Amendment, and there will not necessarily be repercussions for that unless it's done in a certain ways, if it's targeted and all that kind of stuff. I'm no constitutional scholar here, so that would be a question for Ilya Shapiro. But what stood out to, I think, most Americans was just the rank hypocrisy of it, right? So for them to say it depends on the context, when clearly it did not depend on the context when people were misgendering or using the wrong pronouns or engaging in microaggressions or criticizing the lockdowns or saying all lives matter, right? I mean, there is just example after example where we have seen teachers, faculty, admin, students get berated at the least and suspended or fired, for these types of for speech, for this type of speech, which would be protected speech and would fall under the category of the First Amendment. So that's just goes to show that there's a double standard when it comes to certain groups on college campuses. We know that there's a double standard when it comes to Asians, and America is now seeing in the world too that there has been for quite some time a double standard when it comes to Jews as well.
So for people that want to watch that, actually listen or watch that interview that you had with his name again is that he's addressing this issue. Shapiro.
Ilya Shapiro,
Ilya
yeah.
Shapiro. So the more about your program, your show, a website for you.
Yeah, so I produce a show along with my colleague called American Thought Leaders on Epoch TV, hosted by Yanya Kellick. It airs multiple times a week, and we go into, we have deep dive interviews with various thought leaders around the world that really challenge assumptions and tend to be narrative busting on a lot of issues, whether it's public health or freedom of speech or censorship or a whole range of issues.
Okay, so a website address you'd like to share with our viewers here today?
Yeah, I think I think the website is probably Epoch TV / American Thought Leaders. But if you just Google Epoch TV American Thought Leaders, it should come up. Or even if you go to Epoch Times, the homepage, you'll see a tab for Epoch TV right on the top. And our show American Thought Leaders is I think it's the most popular show on Epoch, so it'll take you right to it.
Well, thank you for sharing more information about that. I know a lot of people that I know really like the newspaper for
Thank you.
Epoch Times, but very challenging issues that we're dealing with regarding anti-Semitism. There's some broader anti-Semitism issues to get to as far as definitions here in a little while, but I just wanted more people to know more about your program and what's feeding all of this. Is people's misunderstanding about Israel. And I really think about a school bully situation where, Israel's such a small nation and all these Arab countries, they have plenty of land, but they're acting like bullies and wanting to beat up and take someone's property. But so what do you see kind of as the foundation of anti-Semitism?
Well, the foundation. I mean, are we going all the way back to the Egyptians here in the Bible? No, I mean, anti-Semitism has been around for thousands of years, since time immemorial. But just to reference your point, I think you hit the nail on the head when we are trying to get to the source of the conflict in that region. Contrary to the belief that Jews are some colonialist, usurpers of Palestinian lands. The Arabic conquest of the 7th century were radical in terms of their ability to conquer land and occupy territory. The Arabs are not indigenous to Israel because Israel is part of Judea, and Jews are indigenous to Judea. Arabs are indigenous to Arabia, to the Arabian Peninsula. It's very simple. And they were largely successful, in their conquest, and they spread out and they dominated, incredible amounts of territory, and they would have dominated Europe if they weren't pushed back. I like to say that if Israel goes, Spain would be the next one to go. After that, because this is really about in absolute and complete refusal for there to be a non-Muslim country in that region. That is not acceptable to Arab society. And for people who say, oh, but before there was Israel, Jews and Muslims lived peacefully, that is just a complete falsehood. If you look at the history of Jews in the Middle East and Christians in the Middle East, after Arabs conquered the region, Jews and Christians lived as second-class citizens. They were given what's called dhimmi status, and Jews in particular, since Jews are really considered the ultimate, the lowest of the low in terms of the enemy. They lived with very few rights. They knew their place. They knew what the rules were. They knew where they stood. But they lived. They would have to walk in the gutter if there was no room and they were trying to pass an Arab, they would have to step off the sidewalk and walk in the gutter. A lot of kind of laws like that, which together create the impression of being a second class citizen. And then obviously, before the state of Israel, there was countless massacres of Jews, not just the 1929 Hebron massacre in the region, but there was the Arab revolts and we talk about like ethnic cleansing in that region, but nobody, of Palestinians, nobody talks about the almost 1 million Jews that were ethnically cleansed from Arab lands, from Morocco, from Iraq, from Syria, from Jordan, from Lebanon, around the same time in 1948. These Jews had lived in the Middle East for, some of them for centuries. Their ancestors lived there, and now they were completely dispossessed. They had to leave everything behind, and they came to Israel with nothing on their backs, and Israel was completely broke. They really had no capacity to absorb these refugees, and yet they took them in, and their descendants are now citizens of Israel today, and we never hear about them.
Yeah, it's a very ancient history, and I just think about you mentioned the word colonizer, which I from time to time I hear, but I also most often hear about occupier or illegal occupier. And the Turkish president not too long ago was calling Israel the occupier. So how often do we hear that word occupier from Hamas and so many others? And doesn't that relate to some of this indoctrination at the university level?
Absolutely. Yeah, good old Erdogan, right? Not a big fan of the Jews. Yeah, there's two lies relating to occupation. The first is kind of an easy one to dive into. That's that Israel is occupying Gaza, right? That's not really hard to debunk. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. It was front page news. It was everywhere. It was the 2005 disengagement, unilateral disengagement from Gaza, meant to, it was a goodwill gesture, a gesture of good faith, by the Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, to potentially create a prosperous enclave for Palestinian Arabs to establish their own state, be autonomous. And so Sharon and the IDF, or the IDF under Sharon's instruction, they pulled out every single Jew, both civilian and soldier, from Gaza. I mean, and you can imagine this was terribly traumatic for the Jews living there, who many of whom had been living there for decades. And here your own government, your own military is coming into your house and in many cases dragging you out. For who? For your enemies, right? I mean, this was a very, I mean, in many ways, this was such a traumatic event for Israelis, because they felt like their government was putting Palestinian Arabs, their desires ahead of their own people, their own citizens, and they felt very abandoned by their governments. But at the end of the day, that they all left. There's not one Jew in Gaza today. The Hamas rules completely autonomously. Israel has no jurisdiction over that region. So the idea that they are occupying the region when they've been occupying it when there's been no military or civilian presence is just it kind of betrays the very definition of what occupying means. Now people will say, oh, but there's still a blockade on Gaza. And that's true. There is a blockade on Gaza, but that's a blockade. That does not amount to occupation. These are separate terms here, right? So if you want to talk about the blockade, talk about the blockade. If you want to talk about occupation, talk about occupation. But don't say that the blockade means that Israel is still occupying Gaza. And we can get into the blockade. The blockade was a reaction to Hamas taking power. When Israel left in 2005, there was no blockade, meaning Israel did not control the borders. They did not control the materials that went into Gaza, right? But when Hamas took over, when they won the election, and then they purged the strip of any sort of dissent, any of their political rivals, namely the Palestinian Authority. Hamas put all of their energy into developing rockets, to attack Israel, and they started firing rockets into Israel. And so, of course, Israel is going to protect their citizens living in the Gaza envelope in southern Israel. Of course, they're going to start. What could they do, right? And so they started basically monitoring the border. And it's not true that nothing is allowed into Gaza. They allow in tons of humanitarian aid, medicine, food. But what they are very careful to allow in many cases they don't allow in, is what's called dual use materials, right? So things that can be used for the production of weapons, such as concrete, right? And then there's the other aspect of the fact that Egypt also controls a border with Gaza, and they have the same and even stricter restrictions on what can go in and out of Gaza. Israel until now has actually been letting 30,000 Gazans into Israel every week that have work permits, that have worked there, So there's another lie that people can't move, that they're stuck inside Gaza. Well, tell that to the 30,000 Gazans that were going into Israel legally every day to work. But nobody talks about the fact that Egypt is also imposing this blockade onto the Gaza Strip. All the blame falls on Israel. And then the other lie of occupation, which is much more tricky, and I'm happy to get into it if you want, that relates to the West Bank, right? I wouldn't even use the term occupied territory, although there could technically be an argument to be made for it, to describe these areas like Area B and Area C. Because if you look into the definition of occupation, according to international law, an occupation is when one country, one sovereign nation, occupies another sovereign nation, right? But as we know, there was never a sovereign nation of Palestine. Before it came under Israeli control, it was under Jordanian control. Jordanian actually annexed it, right? And it was an illegal annexation in the sense that the world didn't recognize it. They called it illegal, except for Britain and Pakistan. They were the only two countries that recognized this annexation. But it was never a country. It was part of Jordan. Before Jordan, it was part of the British Mandate, right? And before the British, it was part of the Ottomans. And we can just keep going back and back to the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Romans and the Crusaders, right? All the way back to when it was, Judea and when Jerusalem was the capital of the ancient Israel. So this idea of occupied territory is a lie, because you can't occupy a region that was never sovereign to begin with. That was never a sovereign nation to begin with. A more accurate term for that region would be disputed territory, not occupied.
Well, it is very troubling about people's lack of understanding about the history of Israel, and it is a very checkered situation, very very tumultuous time for Israel on several levels. I was thinking about what you were talking about, Turkish President Erdogan. There was in the news about a lawmaker in Turkey died of a heart attack, cursing Israel.
Right. Oh God, how ironic, huh? Yeah. What a video it was. I read about it before I actually saw the video, and when I saw it, I was like, ooh, what can you say about that? I don't know. I don't know much about him, right? Like, I don't know how deep his hatred goes for Israel. So I really can't speak to the details of that, other than the fact that, that was a very cringe-worthy video. And I can imagine, some people, uttering something like karma under their breath or something like that. But that, I wouldn't go so far as to say something like that.
Well, it was a very shocking video to see that happen. But I think about Israel's ancient enemy, the Philistines, and Gaza. It comes up actually in Jewish scripture several times, but that being the ancient home of the Philistines in the time of Samson and the Ark of the Covenant and all that. This is an age old situation, and strange that Israel's having to face enemies again, but they're not the Philistines; they're Hamas. They had some big ones like Goliath.
Right.
Yeah.
And
many others.
Right. And that's another thing that people don't know. They don't really know where their terminology comes from. And a lot of people aren't aware that the very term Palestine is anything from indigenous. It actually has colonialist roots, because who came up with that name? It was the Romans, right? The Romans were battling the Jews to gain control of the land, and the Jews put up a very, very fierce fight. There was the famous revolt, and they exiled the Jews, and to disassociate the region from its Jewish roots, right? The region was called Judea. They changed the name to Syria Palestina, in reference to what you just said, the Philistines, the biblical Philistines, because the Philistines were, known to be, the enemy of the Jews, right? And so the Romans wanted to basically wanted to stick it to the Jews and insult them, at the deepest level, and basically turn to their holy books and name the region after the biblical enemy of the Jews. So that's just a term that was just had a colonialist origin, and in actuality, the reestablishment of the state of Israel, contrary to what the left and what Islamists want to believe. I think that the creation of Israel is the perhaps history's greatest example of triumph over colonialism, right? I think it was the most incredible example of anti-colonialism. And this is how the world largely saw it when it was established, right? Aside from the Soviet Union, who turned against Israel shortly after its establishment, when it became clear that Israel was going to be siding with the US and not the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So aside from the Soviet Union, and then obviously the religious Arabs in the region, the world largely understood, left and right, that this was such a unique moment in history when an indigenous people who had been exiled for thousands of years but always came back to their land, and who maintained a presence at varying degrees throughout time, and who prayed towards Jerusalem, right? And who yearned to go back, and who wrote about it and sang about it and prayed for it every single day, was finally able to reestablish their nation. Because of a whole bunch of messaging campaigns, and largely by the Soviet Union, which people don't know, that really ramped up throughout after the 6-Day War. We are at this point now where public opinion has largely changed, and unfortunately, it's split largely among political lines. Although you do find common bedfellows with the far right and the far left, right? You have it's not just when we're talking about college campuses, obviously we are talking about the far left as well as the Muslim students, but the far left are have made common. The far left and the neo-Nazi right are aligned on this issue. I mean, there's a reason why neo-Nazis love Ilhan Omar, right? And there's a reason why both the far left and David Duke refer to Israel as a Jewish supremacist state. I mean, they're both in agreement on this issue. And Israel was offered a lot more land than they eventually received in the 1947 UN resolution that split up the land between an Arab and Jewish state. Israel has its basis in legal documents. Area B is controlled civilly by the PA and militarily by Israel. So you could technically say, oh, that part is occupied. And then Area C is under complete jurisdiction of the Israeli authorities. And this was agreed upon. It was signed by the Palestinians, by Yasser Arafat, the leader back then of the Palestinian community. And so this was agreed upon by the Palestinians. There was about 3 or 4 documents, international documents, that made plans for the creation of the Jewish state. And this was before World War II, obviously. And up until the 30s, the late 30s, basically all of Jordan, what became Jordan, was considered was going to be considered Israel. Or people actually say today, the Palestinians do have a state. It's called Jordan, right? Because that was considered Palestine as well, by the Palestinian Arabs, and it was considered Israel to the Israelis. And the British basically lopped off a big chunk of that and gave it to Jordan, and created the modern, created Transjordan, which is what became the modern state of Jordan today. So, the Israelis were actually robbed of, I think, 70% of what they had originally been promised in these documents, and yet they accepted it. But the Palestinian Arabs have a long history of rejectionism, and at the end of the day, they will not accept any Jewish state in any borders in the land.
Well, all this will be playing out, hopefully towards peace very soon, but not before a lot of pain. I know that I know that Israel's gone through so much pain regarding October 7th, and is there a website to reference? I know Epoch Times has some section about regarding Israel reporting. People maybe can learn some more about Hadrian and others.
Well, Epoch Times actually just released, I don't know if it's online yet, but we just put out a special edition. Do I have it on the table here? No, I don't. We just put out a special edition, like physical copy of a magazine that's completely dedicated to Israel and Hamas and the conflict. And I actually wrote it's the main piece in that magazine. It's a very long timeline of 140 years of history in the region. But I encourage anyone to order a physical copy, or to check out the website and see if it's online. If it's not yet, it will be soon. Epoch Times is this is a little unfamiliar territory for Epoch, honestly, because Epoch has focused more on China historically. But luckily, we have wonderful reporters who are truth seeking, and so as we are covering this, we're all learning, and we're definitely not beholden to a lot of the mainstream narratives that you see, so frequently in the news these days.
Okay, for more information, you just go to Epoch Times or Epoch Times.
The epochtimes.com. So I would just suggest using your search, your either Google or DuckDuckGo or Brave, whatever you use, whatever search engine or browser you use. And then you can also follow me on Twitter. I'm very, very active on Twitter, especially these issues. So you can find me. My handle is at Rhea Karys, so it's just my first and last name switched. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing these important insights about Israel, and so we hope that there'll be peace very soon. And thank you, Karys, for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the wonderful work you do. It's just so great to know that there are people like you out there doing this meaningful work.